Lecture 12, Euripides.
Hello and welcome back to Lecture 12, in which we'll finish our discussion of Greek tragedy by looking at the work of the third great tragedian, Euripides. Euripides was born around 480 BC and died in 406, just shortly before the death of Sophocles. So Aeschylus died in 456. Sophocles and Euripides both died 50 years later in 406. We don't know very much at all about Euripides' life. We do know that he first entered plays into competition in 455 when he was about 25 years old and placed third in that first competition. His first victory, his first place prize, came in 441. And during his lifetime, he won only 4 first-place victories. Thus, he was much less successful during his lifetime than either Aeschylus or Sophocles. His last entry into competition in the city Dionysia was in 408. He then traveled to Macedon, where he stayed as a guest of the king, and he died in Macedon in 406. His last 3 plays, including Bacchae, which I'll talk about in this lecture, were performed posthumously and won. Euripides wrote a total of around 90 plays, so about the same number as Aeschylus wrote. 18 tragedies and 1 satyr play have survived. There's one tragedy, Rhesus, that most scholars think is not by Euripides, by the way. This means that we have more plays by Euripides than we have by Aeschylus and Sophocles combined. And this makes us on somewhat firmer ground when we're talking about Euripides' style, Euripides' works, what he does with his plays. Also, due largely to a lucky accident, 9 surviving plays all begin with the Greek letters epsilon, eta, iota, and kappa. And this makes scholars think that what we have with these 9 plays is a survival of 1 volume of a collected works of Euripides, 1 alphabetical or perhaps 2 alphabetical volumes out of a collected works of Euripides. And that, if you think about it, is of the greatest value to scholars because it means, in effect, that we have a random sample of some of Euripides' plays rather than later scholars' careful selection of his best plays. We have, to some extent, in those 9 plays, what appears to be a random, alphabetically arranged survival of 9 of Euripides' plays. And that allows us to have a clearer sense of the range of his work, and some of these plays are very strange indeed, the variety in his work. Also, we simply have so many more of his plays than we have of either Aeschylus or Sophocles' work that we can talk about him in a bit more detail. Now, in this lecture, I want to focus on Euripides' treatment of the gods, as I have to some extent in the lectures on Aeschylus and Sophocles. In particular, I want to look at the way he treats the gods in 2 of his plays, Hippolytus and Bacchae. Any reader of Euripides will notice that the gods in his plays appear to be callous, petty, vengeful, in short, anything but admirable. We can see this in his treatment of Aphrodite in Hippolytus and his treatment of the god Dionysus in the Bacchae, which was, as I said before, one of the last plays he wrote, entered into competition after Euripides' death. Aphrodite and Dionysus in these 2 plays are good illustrations of the callousness, pettiness, vengefulness of Euripides' gods. In the play Hippolytus, Euripides uses the story of Phaedra, a woman smitten with lust for her own stepson, to portray Aphrodite as completely ruthless and without pity for her human victims. Aphrodite, of course, is the goddess of sexual passion. You'll remember from the earlier lecture on lyric, Sappho's hymn to Aphrodite, asking Aphrodite to bring Sappho the person that she desired. Aphrodite is the goddess who imposes sexual passion on humans, and for that matter on gods and animals as well. Now, the traditional story of Phaedra portrayed her as an immoral, lustful woman who tried to seduce a young, chaste man, and her own stepson at that, and took vengeance on him when he rebuffed her. Euripides takes this story and really turns it around on its head. He recasts Phaedra as a good woman fighting desperately against a sickness or a madness inflicted on her by Aphrodite. Aphrodite herself speaks the prologue of the play, and she tells us that what she is after, what she's doing, is trying to get vengeance on Hippolytus. Phaedra is merely a means to an end for Aphrodite. Hippolytus, Aphrodite says in the prologue of the play, worships Artemis, a goddess who is normally the object of worship for young unmarried girls. And Hippolytus, Aphrodite says, refuses to honor her, to pay any attention or any worship to Aphrodite. He's remaining completely chaste, which is very strange for a young Greek man, and he's refusing to honor Aphrodite in any way at all. Therefore, Aphrodite intends to punish Hippolytus through Phaedra. She will make Phaedra fall in lust with Hippolytus, and this will lead to the destruction of Hippolytus, as in fact it does in the play. Now, Aphrodite makes it very, very clear that Phaedra is simply the tool she plans to use to punish Hippolytus. Aphrodite inflicts passion for Hippolytus upon Phaedra as part of a plot to destroy him. She says, Aphrodite says, her suffering, Phaedra's suffering, does not weigh in the scale so much that I should let my enemies go untouched, escaping payment of that retribution that honor demands I have. She says, Phaedra's going to die. I know she's going to die. That's too bad because, as Aphrodite says, that Phaedra is blameless, but she's going to die in order for Aphrodite to get vengeance on Hippolytus. Now, Phaedra struggles against her passion for Hippolytus. In fact, as the play opens, Phaedra is trying to starve herself to death rather than let anyone know that she feels desire for her own stepson. Far from wanting to seduce Hippolytus, she is as horrified by the desire she feels for him as anyone else could be. And she's trying to starve to death rather than admit this passion to him or to anyone. But her nurse, sort of the archetypal foremother of the nurse in Romeo and Juliet and every other meddling nurse in Western drama, Phaedra's nurse worms her secret out of her and then decides to try to be helpful by telling Hippolytus that his stepmother is in love with him. The nurse seems to think that Hippolytus will decide this is a great idea. Hippolytus and Phaedra can sleep together, get it out of their system, and all will be well. Well, Hippolytus does not react that way at all. He is horrified. Phaedra is horrified at the knowledge that he knows of her passion, and she is so afraid that he will tell her husband, his father Theseus, and various other people about this, that she decides the only thing she can do to protect her own good name and through herself, her son's and her husband's good name, she decides the only thing she can do is kill herself and leave a note behind explaining her suicide by saying that Hippolytus attempted to rape her. Now, this is the traditional story of Phaedra's vengeance, that Hippolytus rebuffs her, she accuses him of rape, and kills herself. But Euripides, in his version, makes it very clear that Phaedra does this to protect her own, her son's, and her husband's good name. So, in effect, she's using Hippolytus as a tool the same way Aphrodite used Phaedra herself as a tool. She isn't angry at him, she isn't trying to take vengeance on him, but she is trying to protect her own honor. The idea, of course, is that if people learned that Phaedra had been in love with, or in lust with, or whatever we should call it, her own stepson, they would assume any woman who could stoop to that was so utterly amoral that she had probably betrayed Theseus many times before. That would call her son's legitimacy into question, that would call her honor, and through her Theseus's honor into question. So the only way she can see to protect the good name of her entire family is to sacrifice Hippolytus. Theseus believes Phaedra's note. She's killed herself. That seems to give pretty good backup to the note. Theseus believes Phaedra's note, thinks his son is guilty of assaulting his wife, curses his son, and this leads to Hippolytus' death. In the last scene of the play, the goddess Artemis tries to comfort the dying Hippolytus by saying that the next time Aphrodite feels passion for a human or loves a human, she, Artemis, will kill the human that Aphrodite loves to take vengeance on what Aphrodite has done to Artemis's favorite Hippolytus. Now, that seems to be the best a Euripidean god can offer a dying human in terms of comfort. Don't worry, Hippolytus. The next time Aphrodite feels love for some perfectly innocent, inoffensive human, I will kill him, and that will in some sense make up for your death. As comfort goes, that strikes me as falling rather short. The picture of divinity portrayed by Euripides' late play The Bacchae is equally disturbing. This play focuses on the god Dionysus and tells the story of his vengeance against members of his family who do not believe in his divinity. This is a little complicated, but I'll try to explain it as clearly as I can. Dionysus is unique among the Olympian gods in being the son of a god, Zeus, and of a human mother, Semele. Normally, the offspring of a god-human mating is a human, a heroic human, a human who is better than, nobler, more beautiful, stronger, braver, a better warrior, better than normal humans in many ways, but nevertheless a human. So Dionysus is anomalous in that his father is a god, his mother is a human, but Dionysus himself is not a human being, he's a god. This seems to be because of his very, very unusual birth story. Semele died while pregnant with Dionysus. The jealous Hera, wife of Zeus, tricked Semele into getting Zeus to appear to her in his full transcendent glory as he appears on Mount Olympus. Human flesh and blood cannot bear the sight of a god completely unmasked. Semele went up in a puff of smoke, which was Hera's purpose. Hera was trying to get rid of Semele by tricking her into asking Zeus to show himself to her in his full glory. However, Semele was already pregnant. Zeus rescued the unborn infant. As Semele is incinerated, Zeus snatches the embryonic Dionysus from her womb and implants the embryo in his own thigh. When Dionysus is born, and by the way, there are some wonderful Greek vase paintings showing a very surprised-looking Zeus sitting holding a baby on his thigh, which apparently represent the birth of Dionysus. When Dionysus is born, he's born as a god, not a human. Though I don't know of any ancient author who directly says this, I assume the idea is that because Dionysus spent part of his gestation period in the body of the great god Zeus himself, he came out as a god rather than as a human. However, understandably enough, Semele's sisters, Dionysus's aunts, the sisters of his mother Semele, did not believe that she had ever been involved with Zeus. Now, they can't deny the fact that she was incinerated, that she went up in a puff of smoke. They assume she was hit by a lightning bolt. Zeus is the god of thunder and lightning. They assume that she was killed by Zeus because of her arrogance in boasting that Zeus had been her lover. In other words, they assume she never was involved with Zeus at all. She said she was, and Zeus punished her for this impiety, for this act of hubris, by incinerating her. Now, if Semele was never involved with Zeus, then she never conceived Dionysus, right? There can be no such god as Dionysus in her sister's view, in other words. They take it as a given that their sister was not the beloved of Zeus, and therefore they take it as a given that there cannot be any such god as Dionysus. In the play Bacchae, Euripides tells the story of Dionysus' return to his mother's hometown, the town of Thebes, and the vengeance he takes there on his unbelieving human relatives. The king of Thebes, Pentheus, is Dionysus' cousin, the son of one of Semele's sisters. Pentheus is a young king. His grandfather Cadmus, Semele's father, and so also Dionysus' grandfather, Pentheus and Dionysus' grandfather Cadmus is still alive, but has abdicated in the favor of his young grandson Pentheus. So Pentheus is a young king. Now, Dionysus' vengeance begins, his vengeance against his family, begins with driving all the women of Thebes, including his aunts, Pentheus' mother and two other aunts. He drives all the women of Thebes mad with Dionysiac frenzy. Dionysus is the god of wine. He's also the god of irrationality, uncontrolled behavior, madness, frenzy of all sorts. He inflicts Dionysiac frenzy on the women of Thebes. They all run away from their homes. Nursing mothers drop their infants on the ground and run off to the mountains where they are inspired with Dionysiac madness, with supernatural strength. They can tear animals apart with their bare hands and eat the meat raw. They also have supernatural powers. If they strike the ground with the wands they're carrying, wine and milk and honey flow up out of the ground. So they're having a great time. But it's not terribly good for the society when all the mothers, all the women in town, take off for the countryside, leaving the houses and the children destitute. So Dionysus has driven all the women of Thebes mad. Pentheus, as king of Thebes, tries to take steps to bring the women back to their senses, and this leads to his own destruction by Dionysus. Now, one very important point to understand and to bear in mind is that in the play, Dionysus is disguised as a human being. In fact, he is disguised as a priest of the god Dionysus. We, the audience, know who he is because he speaks the prologue of the play. He comes on and he says, "I am the god Dionysus, disguised as a human being." He explains to us very clearly that he himself is the god, but he is disguised as a human being. He's disguised as a priest of Dionysus. And he says that he has come to Thebes for two main purposes. He wants to establish his worship there, to establish the worship of Dionysus, so he presents himself as a priest, bringing a new religion to this town. He also wants to punish his mother's family for not believing in his divinity. And so we, the audience, know throughout this play that the supposed priest is in fact the god himself, but none of the other characters in the play know that. They think this is a human being. They think this is a priest. Even the chorus, which consists of women from Asia Minor who are voluntary followers of Dionysus. He's driven the women of Thebes mad, but the women of the chorus are voluntary followers of his. They have chosen to believe in him, but even they think that the man they're following is a priest of Dionysus. Even they don't know that this character is the god himself. And that's very, very important because it means that the audience knows whenever another character in the play interacts with Dionysus, we know that that character is interacting with the god himself, but that character thinks he's interacting with another human being, a priest. The play's action revolves around the conflict between Dionysus and his cousin Pentheus. From Pentheus's point of view, of course, if there is no such god as Dionysus, then anyone claiming to be his priest has to be a charlatan, has to be a fake, has to be someone out for whatever he can get from these gullible people whom he persuades to think that there is a new god. Whether he's out to seduce the women, whether he's out for money, whatever, he cannot be a genuine priest if there is no such god as Dionysus. And so to try to protect his city, as a good king should, Pentheus considers it his duty to expose this impostor, as he thinks, for what he is. And so Pentheus orders the so-called priest to be arrested. Dionysus allows himself to be arrested and to be tied up. When the tied-up, bound Dionysus appears, Pentheus questions him contemptuously, cuts off his hair, and orders him to be imprisoned. Pentheus again thinks he's dealing with an impostor, a charlatan. We, the audience, know that he is chaining, cutting the hair off, imprisoning the god himself. We know this cannot have a happy ending for Pentheus. Dionysus soon frees himself from imprisonment, simultaneously causing an earthquake that destroys Pentheus's palace. And that, by the way, is another crux of staging of ancient Greek tragedy. What, if anything, happened in the view of the audience when an earthquake destroys Pentheus's palace? A modern film director could do that with no problem. An ancient tragedian, we don't know what actually happened when the palace is supposedly destroyed by an earthquake. Perhaps nothing at all. The chorus has a long ode in which they say, "Oh, look, the palace is crumbling, the walls are shaking." Perhaps that's enough right there. Perhaps you need nothing visual when the chorus says, "Look, it's an earthquake." Whatever happened, visually or otherwise, when Dionysus appears after the earthquake, he tells the chorus that Pentheus was unable to chain him, unable to keep him bound. Whenever Pentheus tried, a bull appeared instead of the priest, supposedly, the god himself, we know. Now, Pentheus is irritated at his prisoner's escape, but he still doesn't accept the reality of the new god. This could seem like willful blindness. I mean, his palace has just been destroyed by an earthquake when he chained this man up. How much more evidence does he need? But given Pentheus's assumptions, his continued disbelief makes sense. Pentheus cannot accept the idea that there could be a new god. And that is a perfectly reasonable thing for him to be unable to accept the idea of a new god. In Greek myth, the pantheon was pretty much set. Dionysus is an anomaly. The gods had been there. Remember, as I've talked about before, the gods represent forces of nature. They've been there all along. How can there be a new one? There could be the very, very rare human being who became a god after his death. That's very rare in Greek myth. Heracles is the primary example. But other than that, how can there be a new god when the gods constitute the elements of the universe itself? So Pentheus's assumption that there cannot be a new god is reasonable. And even if there could be a new god, the idea of a new god who is born from a human mother and is Pentheus's first cousin, that is even more impossible than the idea of a new god in and of itself. So Pentheus's continued disbelief is really quite understandable given the assumptions on which he is working. From his point of view, the earthquake is just a supremely ill-timed coincidence, but it's not proof that this is in fact a god. Pentheus's problem, however, remains unresolved. The women of Thebes are still under the influence of this newcomer, charlatan or otherwise. And finally, Dionysus suggests to Pentheus that he should go see for himself what the women are doing on the mountainside, that Pentheus should go out and spy on the women of Thebes, see what they're getting up to out there on the mountainside. And as Dionysus suggests this, he slowly gets Pentheus into his power in a very, very eerie scene. By the end of this scene, Pentheus is dressed as a woman, seeing double, and suffering hallucinations. Now, it's worth at this point remembering that, among other things, Dionysus is the god of wine. And I think rather than saying he's the god of wine plus irrationality and frenzy, it's better to say he's the god of irrationality and frenzy, and wine is the substance through which it is easiest for human beings to reach the Dionysiac state. In this play, Pentheus doesn't need to drink to end up inappropriately dressed, staggering around, seeing double, and hallucinating. He doesn't need to get drunk to reach that state of irrationality. He's in contact with the force of irrationality itself, and Dionysus puts him into this state that in normal human society is only reached through mind-altering substances such as alcohol. When Pentheus arrives on the mountainside, he suffers a terrible death, which of course is Dionysus's purpose in getting him out there in the first place. And his death, Pentheus's death, is recounted in one of the most famous messenger speeches of extant tragedy. You'll remember I mentioned when I was talking about Ajax's suicide that death in tragedy is usually described by a messenger speech. And here in Bacchae we have one of the most famous messenger speeches. A messenger comes in to describe Pentheus's death. He tells us that Pentheus was dismembered by his mother Agave and her sisters, who thought he was a mountain lion. They tore him to shreds with their bare hands, and in fact, Agave, Pentheus's mother, is coming back into Thebes, hard on the heels of this messenger speech, carrying Pentheus's severed head stuck on top of her wand. This, by the way, is a place where the Greek conventions of staging using masks work much, much better than our naturalistic conventions of staging. I've seen productions of Bacchae, and it falls apart at this point when the actress playing Agave comes in carrying a papier-mâché head. Instead of reacting with horror, the audience tends to dissolve into laughter. But in the Greek theater, what would the actress playing Agave, who is probably the same actor who had played Pentheus, what would that actor come in carrying? He, or she, if we're talking about the character, would come in carrying the mask that had represented Pentheus on the end of a wand. So what the audience would see as Pentheus's head would be the same thing they had seen as Pentheus's head all along, and the illusion would not be broken the way it is in the modern theater. Cadmus, Agave's father and Pentheus's grandfather, has the terrible task of bringing Agave to her senses and making her understand what she has done, making her realize that it was not a mountain lion, but her own son, whom she tore to shreds with her own hands. So Pentheus, Agave, and Cadmus all suffer dreadfully. Pentheus is dead. Agave killed him. Cadmus has to live with his grandson's death and the knowledge that his daughter caused it. Dionysus' revenge against his family is complete, and his worship is established. No one can any longer deny that he's a god. Now, unfortunately, the end of the play is damaged and several lines is missing. There was a scene in which Dionysus, revealed as a god, spoke directly to Agave and Cadmus, and Cadmus reproached Dionysus for his cruelty. This scene is damaged, but enough remains that we can tell that much, that Cadmus reproached Dionysus for his cruelty and his mercilessness, and he said that gods should be above human-like passions. But Dionysus remained unmoved and implacable. And Dionysus's lack of compassion and forgiveness are a constant throughout the play. He shows absolutely no understanding for human frailty. He's utterly focused on the dishonor done to him, both directly and through his mother, the fact that it is reasonable and understandable for his relatives not to believe in his divinity never seems to cross his mind, or if it does cross his mind, it doesn't matter to him. He doesn't care. So the god Dionysus is shown as having a desire for vengeance that in many ways is reminiscent of the worst types of human obsessiveness, the worst elements of humanity. And so just as he does with Aphrodite and Artemis and Hippolytus, in Bacchae, Euripides gives us a picture of the gods that is very deeply disturbing, a god who is not only not exempt from human passions, but prey to the worst kind of human passions, and incapable of pity, mercy, forgiveness, any of the better human elements. It's clear from the extant plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles that this isn't the only way to portray gods in tragedy. So the obvious question is, why did Euripides choose to portray the gods as petty and vindictive? He didn't have to. Aeschylus doesn't. Sophocles doesn't, with the possible exception of Athena and Ajax. So why does Euripides foreground the idea that the gods are petty and vengeful? Now, part of the answer to that, I think, lies in the dual nature of the gods themselves. As I've mentioned several times already, these are anthropomorphic beings who are also personifications of powerful natural forces. And anthropomorphism brought many problems with it from the Homeric epics on, or I suppose we could even say from the Epic of Gilgamesh on. Endowing the gods with human-like qualities is an aid to conceptualizing them. It gives us a way to think about them. But since the gods are immortal and ageless, they are immune from suffering, and this inevitably implies a lack of nobler human qualities like courage and altruism. If you think about it for a minute, we admire courage. What we mean by that is we admire people risking their own lives, or at least risking grave injury, for some higher purpose, for some better cause, to aid others. We particularly admire courageous altruism, someone sacrificing their own life to help others. A being who cannot die or even be seriously wounded cannot be courageous. Such a being has nothing to risk, and therefore has no possibility for courage, altruism, or any other such noble human characteristic. So to some extent, a certain lack of true nobility among the gods is built into the system of anthropomorphism. But to account for the pitilessness and mercilessness of the gods in Euripides, the more important point is not anthropomorphism itself, but the fact that these gods personify forces of nature. Aphrodite is sexual passion, and it is an undeniable and regrettable fact of human existence that misplaced sexual passion does destroy lives, does rip people apart. Dionysus is frenzy, irrationality, among other things, the intoxicating power of alcohol. To take another example, Poseidon is the sea. And when we view them in this light, it makes no sense to ask such deities for mercy. If I'm shipwrecked at sea and I drown, it makes no sense for my relatives to say to the ocean, "Why did you do this to her? She didn't deserve it." That's not the kind of element, the kind of force to which it makes any sense to address a plea for mercy. And so insofar as these gods are representatives of the forces of nature, they simply are, as Euripides portrayed them. The forces of nature are pitiless and merciless. Now, the nature of the gods, who and what the gods are, was one of many religious and philosophical topics that were fiercely debated in 5th century Athens. And I think by pushing the anthropomorphism of the gods to this deeply disturbing extreme, Euripides was trying to contribute to this debate. No one can deny the power of such forces as sexual attraction or the power of the sea. We can't deny that those things exist. but we can debate whether anthropomorphizing those forces as self-aware, sentient, gendered beings is the proper or most useful way to theorize them. And so it seems to me that part of what Euripides is doing in his treatment of the gods is to say, in effect, if we anthropomorphize our gods, then these are the gods we get. So questioning not the existence of the gods, but the traditional way of talking about, of conceptualizing those gods. Now, some critics have suggested that Euripides was an atheist, but this doesn't seem likely, to me at least. It's hard to read Bacchae as a denial of the power of Dionysus. And in fact, in a culture where the gods are personifications of realities of nature, atheism in the sense of disbelief in the existence of such gods is almost a cognitive impossibility. To ask, do you believe that Aphrodite exists, would be the same as saying, do you believe that sexual attraction exists? Is there such a thing? It's a nonsense question. So atheism in the sense of thinking there are no such forces is a cognitive impossibility. It's more likely, I think, that Euripides was suggesting that however those undeniable forces of nature should be conceptualized, traditional anthropomorphism was simply not adequate. So in this lecture, we finished our discussion of Greek tragedy by looking at the works of the third great tragedian, Euripides. In the next lecture, the beginning of part 2, we will turn to another genre that developed in 5th century Athens, history, and we'll look at the work of the historian Herodotus.